Hey Sue, how are you?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
Doing good. I can see that you're not muted, but it's not really coming through very good.
Oh dear.
No, sounds good to me, Rachel.
Oh,
Turn your
maybe it's
headphones
just
up
me.
on the little speaker. Your microphone, the little rolly knob.
How are you, Chris?
I'm good. Thanks for asking. I'm glad to hear that you're okay.
How's the weather?
Getting warmer. Um, it'll be close to 90 in town today, but it's just in the low 80s here.
No, I know.
How about you?
It's 90 in Boston
Ugh, that sounds terrible.
and muggy.
Yeah, it's not muggy here right now. It's actually quite nice.
Well, you're in the mountains, aren't you, Chris?
Yep, you got it. Yeah. It's got its cons, but the weather generally is not one of them.
I hated to leave South Carolina. I just loved it.
Yeah. Yeah. Like Greenville's a great little place. I mean, it's a great town. It's got anything you'd ever want to do. It's clean. It's nice. It doesn't feel too big. And yeah, it's close to a lot of stuff that you'd want to do. You want to go,
Absolutely.
you can be up heck at my house in an hour and 45 minutes. And yeah, and it's 10, 15, 20 degrees cooler.
Well, you're close to Asheville, aren't you?
We're about 45 minutes to an hour away from Asheville.
I like Asheville too.
I used to like Asheville. Yeah. It's changed a lot in the last 10 years.
Too
Um,
commercial?
um, no, it's not the commercial. It's just, it feels dirtier. It feels, not as safe as it used to. Um, yeah, Greenville feels a lot cleaner and nicer and more family friendly.
Well, Asheville's gotten so popular.
Right. It's kind of bonkers. Like we still enjoy going up there. We've got our little restaurants and the breweries that we like to go see and that kind of thing, but we don't go downtown much anymore. Um, yeah.
Well, where is everybody?
This is a good
John is
question.
usually on the first one.
I don't know. Usually people are lined up. Like there's been a lot of new people lately that I've been happy to see.
Yeah, several people I didn't know.
I mean, there's a bunch of people I don't know still from Beth Israel. The whole Friday night crew, I don't have any idea who comes on Fridays at all.
I ordered the two books that
You
Fred
got the
recommended.
the Noah Tishby book and the what's the one written by the Irish guy?
The
Yeah,
Siege. The
The
Siege.
Siege. Yep. I enjoyed The Siege a lot.
Did you?
It's not as like you get it and you're like, wow, this is a big thick book. And like, no, most of it is just footnotes and references in the back. Um, and Noah's book is just an easy read. I think I read it like one afternoon on Shabbat. Um, yeah, it's good too. It's a whole different way of looking at the situation. She's very pop culture-y and, very easy reading. He's got a lot more meat and potatoes in there.
Well, it looks as if the government may fall. I'm going to be interested to. I wish Fred would come on so we could ask him what he thinks.
Right? Yeah, I got a bunch of Israelis on Twitter that I talk to, and they're not so sure it's what's going to happen. It's all higgledy-piggledy. Everybody's got their opinion on why and reasons why and everything, and I just don't know enough to know.
Well, I think you have to be there.
I think so too. Think so too. Seems like it's kind of sad because they know more about what's going on in our country politically sometimes than we do, and I know very little about what goes on in Israel politically. Um, yeah, I'm trying to learn, but it's just so difficult to get good information. Everything seems to come from one side or the other. It's hard to get anything kind of down the middle. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Okay, fly. Go away.
Come on, Fred, we want to talk to you about the situation in Israel. He still has family there. His first wife was an Israeli.
Oh,
You didn't know that? Okay. His first wife, who unfortunately died of breast cancer, was an Israeli. And so he still has family,
right.
extended family there. I don't know how frequently he talks to them anymore, but he's probably he's for an American, he's probably as good a source as we're likely to get.
Gotcha. Matt always seemed to have his pulse on what was happening over there. At least that's what, he portrayed.
Yes.
Yeah. It's just hard to know. Yeah, gosh, nobody's coming on,
It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell what's going on here.
right? And yeah. There's a Fred, or not a Fred, there's a young Harold
Yeah.
on a bike. He must be eating.
There he
There
is.
he is. See, and he is eating. I know Harold.
I
How
got
old were you
a
when you
little
were up?
after 5, and I'm on this till 6:30, and then I have another meeting at 8:30. So
All right, just got one at 7,
How
so
old
yeah.
were you when you were on the bike, Harold?
On the picture.
He's not saying.
that no. That picture is about only 10 years old.
Oh, okay.
Really, I don't even think it's that old. Hold on. I have to let me turn off my video for a minute. Yeah, I can tell by the which vest I was wearing. So yeah, it's about 10 years old.
Okay.
Not far. Still got the same motor. I mean, I've had that same motorcycle for 29.
There's Fred.
There he is. Hey, Fred. There
Hey,
you go. Now I can see you.
there you
You're
go.
not Kilroy over there.
No, no.
We were discussing whether or not the government is going to fall in Israel. What's your opinion?
I hope it does.
Well, that's different than what
Yeah.
you think's going to happen.
I know. I have no idea. And even if it does, which is a good chance it will, nobody has any idea what's going to follow it. You know,
Parliamentary government systems are kind of crazy.
yeah, they are. Well, so I don't know. Basically, the Supreme Court finally, faced. I think the biggest issue Israel faces. These Haredi Jews now are I think 13 or 14% of the population. And they grow faster than any other part. And you can't, in a few more years, this will be like 15 to 20% of the population not working, not paying taxes, not serving in the military. It's
And
impossible.
costing money.
Yeah, you can't sustain it.
No, I
And this,
tend to agree with you. I mean, yeah.
and this is really the longest war Israel's ever fought. Israel always fights short wars. And all these people they've called up, they have places in the economy. The economy is going to tank unless they get another source of troops.
Meeting. Which meeting? I was just there.
Okay.
Yes, you know what? There you go.
I saw pictures of the religious Jews protesting being conscripted.
Mhm.
And, they're saying they're preserving Judaism in their way.
Well, they are. I mean, that's true. But
Right.
you the rabbis that created the Talmud, they spend all their time studying, all had day jobs.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody, there's no tradition of studying Torah 24/7, for a whole community. So, it's something that eventually had to come to a crisis. It's been building up for years. And so I don't know what's going to come out of it, but we'll see. Anyway, speaking of Israel, that's what we were going to start talking about tonight, modern Zionism. If you're following along on the outline, it's on page 18. So, um, and Zionism, the word itself comes from the Hebrew Zion, Zion, which is really just a poetic biblical word for Jerusalem. And Zionism really has been part of Judaism for at least a couple of thousand years. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in the first century, the rabbis actually set up a number of mourning customs for it, some of which we don't do anymore. For instance, if you built a house, you would leave one room unfurnished. If you were giving a dinner, you'd leave one course uneaten. Most of these sort of faded out with time, and there are only two that we still observe. One is if you go into a traditional synagogue, there's not going to be a piano or organ. The idea the rabbis back then had was that instrumental music was part of the temple service. And so as a mourning custom, now that we no longer have the temple, there would be no instrumental music in the synagogue. That was going to be out until the temple was rebuilt. And of course, the other one that everybody's more familiar with, is at the Jewish wedding where the last thing you do is break a glass. And the idea is that even at the happiest of occasions, you still have to remember that, that we haven't returned to Zion and the temple still hasn't been built. Well, the one modern rabbi said it really means it's the last time the groom gets to put his foot down.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So
But, uh,
my
but as
my
yeah.
daughter's wedding, um, one of their friends is a glass blower and made them this really pretty, I wouldn't cup. I wouldn't really call it a glass, but they broke it, but then they were going to reheat it and shape it.
And fix it. Yeah.
And I was like, wait a minute, I thought it's supposed to stay broken so that you can never put it
Yeah.
back
Yeah,
together.
it kind of defeats the thought behind the tradition. Yeah. Actually, I was at one wedding. I don't know why they did it, but they wrapped up a whiskey shot glass in a napkin. And those things are impossible to break. And that poor groom was just stomping on it and it wouldn't break.
Hey, Fred,
Anyway,
real quick, can we just define what Zionism is first? Um,
well, what it was, basically, initially, if you go back to the beginning of the first century, it was really more of a religious ideal. As the centuries went by, and obviously Jerusalem was not going to be rebuilt, and the temple was not going to be rebuilt, and the Jewish life was in diaspora. It became kind of a religious idea. Jews started believing someday the Messiah will come, and Jews will all be gathered back to Israel, and then the temple will be rebuilt. And even in the Siddur today, you see passages, about rebuilding the temple speedily in our time, this kind of stuff. The synagogue liturgy is still full of it. But what we really call Zionism now, as a practical plan to actually do something about it, really didn't start till the 19th century. So that, what we call Zionism now, really is only about 200, a little over 200 years old. And it began in the 19th century, probably for a number of reasons. One is that nationalism was really a big idea then. In 1820, the Greeks broke loose from the Ottoman Empire, and Greece became a modern unified nation for the first time in its history. In 1860, Garibaldi took all the Italian states and put them together to make the modern nation of Italy. In 1870, Bismarck did the same thing, that basically for Germany, and Germany was born as a nation. So it's the idea of people that have a common culture, common language, common history, ought to have their own political entity. So nationalism was really kind of in the air then. And of course, that was matched with what we were talking about last week, the deteriorating conditions in Eastern Europe. As things in the Tsarist Empire got worse and worse, Jews started emigrating. Of course, 90+% of all the immigration went to America. A little bit of it went to Western Europe, but most of the Western European countries wouldn't take many of them. They limited immigration. And a very few idealists started thinking about going back to Palestine. Um, the other thing that made it practical was that Palestine at that time belonged to the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire kind of peaked in power and extent about the middle of the 17th century. And then it went into a long decline. And by the middle of the 19th century, it was obvious to all the European powers that it was probably going to break up sometime in the not too distant future. And basically, all the big colonial powers, England, France, Germany, Russia, were all kind of like buzzards circling it, watching. There were a number of conferences on what was called the Eastern Question. And the Eastern Question really was who got to grab what when the Ottomans finally, gave up. The European nations had their eyes on it, and it was pretty clear that soon that land was going to be up for grabs soon. Um, and there were a number of early people whose names are really forgotten who began it. The earliest one really was back in 1820, and he was actually a mystical Kabbalistic rabbi named Yehuda Alkali. He was a Bosnian rabbi, and he really was inspired by the Greeks, breaking away, rebelling against the Ottoman Empire and forming their own country. And he believed that the Jews could do the same thing. But basically, he was a mystic living, in a place that nobody gave much attention to. So very few people read anything that he wrote about it. Later in the 19th century, Moses Hess in Germany, who was actually one of Karl Marx's teachers. He was a professor, and he also wrote that it was really time for the Jews uh, to go back to their homeland. By the middle of the 19th century, Jews have been trying to assimilate into European society ever since they were emancipated, in the 18th century Enlightenment. And they were making some progress, but there were a number of skeptics. There are a lot of Jews who believe that anti-Semitism was basically such an indelible part of Western culture that it was never going to end. That Jews would never be totally accepted in any European state. And the future really lay in going back and building their own country. But again, Hess was an academician, but most people didn't read him, and he didn't have much impact. One guy who did have an impact was an Orthodox rabbi in Russia named Hersh Kalisher, who believed that it really was time to go back. And he actually inspired a lot of university students in Russia to go to Palestine starting in the 1880s. And this is what was called the first Aliyah. A lot of historians divide Israeli history into Aliyahs, different surges of immigration. And the first one started in the 1880s with Eastern European Jews going to Palestine, buying land there from the Ottomans, and trying to set up agricultural colonies. And for the most part, it was a failure. A lot of these kids were university students who had never done any physical work in their lives. They knew absolutely nothing about agriculture. Malaria was endemic in Palestine at that time. The land was half swamp and half desert. And most of the first Aliyah settlements really failed. The few that hung on was mainly due to charity from wealthy Jews who kept them going and supported them. But it really looked like the Zionist movement really wasn't going to come to very much by the end of the 19th century. And
So,
there were also Christians who contributed to it. For some of them were anti-Semites. You basically thought, yeah, Zionism is a great idea. Get the Jews out of our country and let them go back to the Middle East. So that was one factor. But there
so,
were
so, so, so just so that I can understand this better, I mean, I really love what you're doing. Would you say that Judaism is the religion, but Zionism or Zionist is a political movement to create a Jewish state?
It was, yes, it is. It was a practical political movement, although you can't really take the religion out of it,
I
without the
understand
fact
that.
that there was all the centuries of religious, feeling for it. But you're right, it was a political movement. And that's what really distinguishes it from all the previous Zionism. The previous Zionism was purely religious. If you prayed hard enough, the Messiah would come someday and we'll go to Israel. But starting in the 19th century, this was a political movement. Um, and there was actually one other Christian contributor, though, who was very sympathetic, George Eliot. Um, if you're into Victorian novels, she probably wrote the greatest Victorian novel in Middlemarch. Or you may remember you probably had to read Silas Marner in high school. She wrote that. But for some reason, late in her career, she was actually a woman named Mary Ann Evans who wrote under the pen name George Eliot. But for some reason, late in her career, she got really interested in Judaism. It's not really clear why, and spent 3 years just totally immersing herself in Jewish studies. She actually learned Hebrew. She actually did Talmud study, met with rabbis, and just really got deeply into Judaism and wrote a novel called Daniel Deronda, which was really a bestseller in the late 19th century. And Daniel Deronda was a Sephardic Jew who was orphaned as a young child, adopted by an aristocratic English family, and then later discovers his Jewish roots and actually goes back to Palestine to help build the Jewish state there. Um, so there were a number of Christians, just like there are Christian Zionists here in America. Some of the strongest support of the state of Israel are evangelical Christians. And that was true really back at the beginning of the 19th century. In fact, one of the strongest Christian supporters was an Englishman named Arthur Balfour, who was become a little famous later on with his support of the Jewish state. Um, but things really weren't going well, in the early years in the 1880s and 90s. And the man who's really given the credit for turning it around and saving Zionism is Theodor Herzl. His name probably more than any other is really associated with the founding of the Jewish state. And he was really a very unlikely guy to do that. He was born into a wealthy, assimilated Viennese family who were not observant Jews. He received very little Jewish education. And actually, as a young man in college, considered converting to Christianity because there were better job opportunities that way. And he actually made his living after college as a freelance writer. He wrote several plays that were produced on the Vienna stage. He wrote some essays, wrote some op-eds for newspapers. But the turning point in his life came at around 1890 when he got a job as the chief Paris correspondent of the major Viennese newspaper. So he was in Paris in 1894 when the Dreyfus case broke. And Albert Dreyfus was a captain in the French army who was falsely accused of espionage, of passing military secrets to the Germans. He was tried, convicted, and sent to Devil's Island. And it really wasn't until decades later that judgment was finally reversed and he was exonerated. And Herzl was in Paris covering the trial. And what interested him was not the guilt or innocence of Dreyfus. He actually thought Dreyfus was guilty based on what he knew about it. What really struck him was before Dreyfus was sent off to prison, there was a ceremony in the courtyard of the military academy in Paris where he was ceremonially stripped